Everybody go nuts. Yay! Cool. Awesome. So, welcome to Introduction to Logic. I'm Nathan. Nice to meet you all. I hope you're all doing well. Lovely to see you. And thank you for coming. I realize that it's probably not been the easiest time getting to Tilburg, but yeah, thanks for being here. I want to start off by saying I'm slightly disappointed in the class because it used to be called Introduction to Logic and Philosophy, and I could make a joke about how there's actually no philosophy in this at all, and then they took that away from me when they changed the name. But I can still at least make the meta joke. Anyway, so the aim for today is basically just to kind of talk a little bit about what formal logic is, and I'm going to give you my sales pitch as to why it's good to study it, thereby vindicating my job. Then I want to talk a little bit about some background notions, some kind of key ideas that we'll use, and we'll try and recapture using various formal machinery. And then we'll actually start in on learning our first formal language, which we're going to call truth functional logic. It's also sometimes called sentential or propositional logic. We'll just make the first kind of few steps along the pathway. So that's the plan for today. I expect we might use the whole time. We'll sort of see how it goes. With regards to how we use our time, probably by now you've had a couple, well, I know you had at least one lecture earlier today. So with regards to structuring the lectures, there's basically two ways we can do this. We can go for about 45-ish minutes, take a break, and then go again. Or we can just push on through and aim to end about 10 minutes early. Either one is perfectly fine with me. I'm good either way. Hell, I could go all the time with this. I love it. Is there a preference? Do people prefer that going for a bit and a break or going and then ending a little early? I think we'll go break, and then we can kind of come back and think about it next time. So okay, just want to get that out of the way. Again, we could talk about exactly how to structure it and all that. The other thing to note with regards to how these will go, it's mostly going to be me, well, in this case, literally yelling at you. Right? That's what the lectures are for. But of course, I should ask, did everybody get a chance to watch Lecture 0, the video? Some people did. Okay, it's on the Canvas page. That details how the assignments work, the sort of structure, the course, stuff like that. So I'm not really going to go over that here. But note, we basically have, we're going to see a lot of each other because we have weekly lectures and then there are also weekly tutorials. So those start tomorrow, bright and early, because they hate me. So there's 2 tutorials, I think, tomorrow, 2 tutorial groups on Thursday, and 2, I think, for this course on Friday. Please go to the ones you're assigned to. Given the numbers, we might track some of the groups. We'll see how populated some of them really are. We'll sort of play that by ear. But at least for the first week, go to the group that you're actually a part of. You can find that out through my timetable. It's lovely. It's fun. We'll talk about what we do in them in the tutorials. Cool. Okay. Should say again, it's going to be mostly me yelling at you, but if you have questions or anything, stick your hand up. I'll ask to stick your hands up instead of just talking because there's just too many of us and it's going to get too messy if people just talk. And also don't chatter amongst yourselves too much because this thing is actually surprisingly good at picking people up. And sometimes people say things that shouldn't be recorded. He says knowingly. Okay, cool. So let's talk about what logic is and why study it. Here's a background idea. Arguments. So arguments are often used to talk about the thing at the top, right? When you're fighting over exactly how much Chet has to pay for brunch, right? But that's not really the kind of thing that philosophers or, well, even people who do AI are really interested in. For our purposes, when we're after arguments, we mean something like this thing at the bottom. So here's my beautiful dog, Mira, looking very much like she wants me to draw her like one of my French girls, right? So here's an argument. Mira's a dog. All dogs are canines, therefore Mira is a canine. Right? So, cool. Not a terribly informative argument, but we can already kind of get something out of this initial structure. We basically have some premises, 1 and 2, which are supposed to be something like reasons or motivations for accepting 3, the conclusion. You've seen this before. This is the kind of thing you do all the time when you're, say, trying to debate with your friends about whether to have pizza or sushi, right? You say things like, dude, we had pizza yesterday. We haven't had sushi in 3 months. There's a deal on so we can get half off the second order. What are you doing here? You're corralling reasons to try and push us towards a particular conclusion. That's what I think an argument is. Or, to give a definition, we might say an argument is any collection of premises together with a conclusion. Right? Note the any collection. So here's a fun question. What's the minimum number of premises I need for an argument? Anybody want to bid lower? 0, right? We can have a 0 premise argument. We could just have a conclusion, right? Mira's a canine. Now that's not a terribly convincing conclusion. We need some reasons. But we might think about, and we'll come back to this in about 16, 17 slides, we'll think about certain kinds of things that might serve as conclusions where we don't need any premises at all. They're real fun. So this already suggests the real reason I think this course is actually useful for you. The deep, dark lesson, I'm going to teach you all about formal logic and stuff like that. Here's the real deep, dark lesson. Think about edge cases. Think about what actually follows from the rules and setup that you've been given. Think about how to push them, how to tweak them, how to make them stronger or weaker, what their problems are. Another way to put it is, I think this course will basically make you a much better board game player. That is, you'll actually figure out what the rules really say. And I think that's an incredibly useful thing if you're, say, gonna design some AI stuff. So that's the real reason they send you to me, but also formal logic's important. Anyway, okay, so an argument. We've got a definition of an argument. Now here's something kind of cool. Philosophers, you're all philosophers now. You're all logicians now that you're in this class. We're argumentation machines, right? You feed in food, coffee, in my case, way too much beer, and we output arguments. Sometimes this kind, sometimes that kind. It depends on which way the things go and how much beer we've had. Right? But of course, arguments aren't all created equal. Some are good and some are bad. So we might wonder, what makes an argument good? How can we tell when an argument's good or bad? How can we sort the wheat from the chaff? Well, here's an idea. In a good argument, if you believe the premises, then you should believe the conclusion. A good argument, in some sense, lets you derive the conclusion from the premises you've been given. So think about the Mira argument just a second ago, right? We look at this one, right? 1 and 2 seem to kind of suggest or push us to 3. Given 1 and 2, we can make our way to 3. Again, I'm kind of dancing around. I'm using a bunch of figurative language or metaphors here, but there's something like this lurking. Good arguments let you do that. Bad arguments don't. But actually, this suggests maybe 2 different ways that an argument can be bad. So one way is by content. That is, one or more of the premises might be false, might be wrong, might be misleading. Right? But a different way, and a fundamentally different way, is that it might just be that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So we'll try and cash that out a little bit as we go along, but let's talk about the first way first, kind of way of content, where an argument's bad because of bad content. So here's another argument about my dog Mira, right? Premise 1, Mira is a sausage. Premise 2, Mira is not cute. Premise 3, all non-cute sausages are felines. Conclusion, therefore Mira is a feline. Now here's the thing to note. All 3 premises are false. Mira's not a sausage, she's a dog. Mira is decidedly cute, and fuck you if you say she's not. Right? And 3 is just false, right? Non-cute sausages aren't felines. So clearly there's something kind of bad about this argument with regards to the truth of the premises. But here's something interesting. It's actually kind of good. What's the sense in which this argument's good?
1 and 2 lead you to 3. 1 and 2 lead you to 2, or 1, 2, and 3 lead you to 4.
Yeah, right? If 1, 2, and 3 were true, it sure as hell looks like 4 would be 2. In fact, it looks like there's no way for us to accept 1, 2, and 3 if we buy them as being true, where we wouldn't also then be forced to say 4 is true too. Do we see the idea? No, what's really neat is it doesn't matter that all 4 of them are false. What matters is that there seems to be a kind of connection. Were 1, 2, and 3 true, then 4 would be true. So we're starting to cash out this idea of follows from. So here's one way we might do it, right? We've already sort of seen, hey, content can be funny. Let's think about form now. Well, look, a conclusion follows from the premises, provided that were all the premises true, the conclusion must be as well. Whenever the premises are true, so is the conclusion. Or, flipping this around, we'll say an argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all of its premises to be true and its conclusion false. Note, this is basically the same thing, right? Whenever the premises are all true, conclusion must be too. So, let me tell you right now, the definition of validity, that's the first question on the final, and that's the first question on the midterm. I'll ask you this definition, I want you to spit it back to me. Because this is the biggest notion we're after. This is the most important thing. We're after validity in this course. So, what's the definition of validity? An argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all of its premises to be true and its conclusion false. What's the notion of validity capturing? This idea of follows from. Were the premises to be true, so must the conclusion. Make sense? So, one very important thing to note about this notion of validity. It is not about the actual truth or falsity of the premises and the conclusion. It's about whether it's possible or not to make the premises all true and the conclusion false. So we don't really care whether the premises are in fact true. That's somebody else's job. We just care about whether it's possible that these ones are all true and this one's false. This is actually going to be one of the best things about formal logic. We don't have to get out of our armchair to do it. We don't have to learn about the world. We just have our beautiful machinery to do the job for us. So let's talk a little bit about validity. Because I mean, you got the basic idea. So let's run some tests. Here's the argument we saw earlier. Right? What do we think? Valid, invalid. Valid, invalid. Why?
Because if all the premises are to be true, then the fourth conclusion would also be true.
Bingo. Or, to put it in terms of the definition, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Nice. Okay. Note, what's interesting, we said earlier, these are all false. So again, the actual truth or falsity doesn't matter. It's just about whether it's possible to make all the premises true and the conclusion false. Here's another argument. Tilburg's in the Netherlands. Nathan's human. Therefore, Willemswee is based in Tilburg. Valid, invalid. Okay, why is it invalid?
Because it's not, doesn't make sense
Kind of, but let's think about it in terms of our definition, right? So we've got this notion of validity, and our definition of validity says an argument's valid if and only if it's impossible to make all the premises true and the conclusion false. So what would we need to be able to do if this is invalid?
Make him not be human, but the conclusion will still be true. Like,
Other way around. Remember, go back to the definition. An argument's valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So what do we need to find if an argument is invalid?
The premises could be false and the conclusions could be false.
Other way.
Okay.
So here's what we want. This argument's invalid because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Remember, let's go back to the definition. Definition says it's valid if it ain't possible to do that. If it is, then it ain't valid. If I can come up with even one scenario where premises are true and conclusions false, argument's invalid. Only need one. So, can somebody tell me a story where the premises are true and the conclusion's false?
If Tilburg were to be outside of the Netherlands, Willem II would be outside of Tilburg.
Yeah. So let's say a Russian oligarch buys Willemsvee and they decide to move it to Breda to really make the conflict with NAC that much more interesting, right? Because, Breda's got a better train connection, so you can get more fans and they can build more city and build more stadium, blah, 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 blah. That'd be one where these two are true and this one's false. Or maybe Willemsvee doesn't do too well in the corona crisis and they go into bankruptcy and cease to exist. Cool, 1 and 2 are true and 3 is false. Or maybe the football club was just never founded. Cool, 1 and 2 are true and 3 is false. Again, what are we looking for when we test for validity? We want to see if it's possible for all of the premises to be true and the conclusion false. If you find even one, thanks but no thanks. Now to reiterate, why are we interested in validity? Why is it we want to care about validity? What's it supposed to be doing? Anybody remember? What's it supposed to capture? Oh, don't tell me I lost you already. Well, let's go back. The notion of validity is supposed to capture the idea of follows from. So we have this intuitive idea. Hey, conclusion follows from the premises, if whenever they're true, so is the conclusion. There's a kind of guarantee of truth. Validity does that. It's about preservation. If we start off with true premises, we must then have a true conclusion. We never lose truth. Okay? So we've seen one valid argument. We've seen one invalid argument. Now let's go to the real fun one. Okay, premise 1, Mars has exactly 2 moons. Premise 2, Mars has exactly 37 moons. Conclusion, therefore Tilburg is in California. Valid, invalid. I saw one person just doing this. What do we think? Valid, invalid? Some thumbs up, some thumbs down. Anybody want to make the case for why it's invalid? Good. So there's this kind of comes back, I forget who it was, somebody over here mentioned. I think that it seems like the conclusion just kind of comes out of nowhere, right? But let's use the notions we built up. Right? I asked about validity, and we have a definition for validity. Yeah? Yeah, so there's something real interesting about 1 and 2, right? If 1's true, 2's false. And if 2 is true, 1 is false. So to put some terminology on it, which we'll talk about in a second, they're jointly inconsistent. Cool. So what does that mean? It seems to suggest that it's impossible for all the premises to be true. Interesting.
That means it's also impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false.
Yeah, right? No matter how hard you work, you can never make all the premises true. So we don't care about the truth value of the conclusion. It's already impossible. This argument's valid. Here's why. Definition of validity. An argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Here's something neat about this argument. It's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. It's also impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion true. I can't do the first part, so I can't do the first part and some more shit too. Right? I've already got the impossibility I need right off the bat. The inconsistency of the premises does the job for me. So before we go on, two questions. First one, who finds this very weird? Be honest. Good. Well, pretty much everybody. Now, who doesn't believe me that it's valid? Okay. It genuinely is, I promise. But thank you for taking one for the team. So here's another case where, again, it's very helpful to be very clear about exactly what the definition says. Right? Our definition says it's impossible to do this and this. And if we already know this bit's impossible, we don't care about the other half. So we've learned one cheap way to guarantee validity right off the bat. If you have inconsistent premises, bang, you know you have a valid argument. Now here's a question. Does that mean it's a good argument? Why not?
It doesn't follow. The premises don't be different.
They do though, because whenever they're true, the other thing must be true as well.
The conclusion does not spring from the
There's something missing, yeah? That's one other thing too. Remember the other way I mentioned, the other way arguments can be bad? In this case, we know one of the premises must be false. We maybe don't know which one it is. In this case, it's the second one, right? But we know at least one of them must be false. But it's already telling us something, which we talked a little bit about already, which is that if we're interested in the way of form, right, that kind of minimum bar an argument has to pass to get in, that's one thing. Doesn't necessarily involve thinking about which premises are true or false. If we look at this purely in terms of structure, cool. Weird, as everyone's hand suggested, but technically the conclusion follows from in the way that we've characterized it. That's good. I think it's an interesting little quirk. And this notion of validity seems strange, but it genuinely is extremely powerful because it's not going to lead us wrong in the sense that we're never going to find arguments where we lose truth. That's the thing that we care about. We might have never had it in the first place, like with this one, and some weird shit happens, but acceptable losses. Okay. So, of course, we might be interested in what happens when we have both good arguments in the sense of form and true premises. If you're actually interested in that. Right? I'll give you another notion. An argument is sound if and only if it's both valid and all of its premises are true. This is a definition for people who are interested in, the actual truth or falsity of premises. That's not me. That's beyond my pay grade. Here's an interesting question. If we have a sound argument, what's the truth value of its conclusion? So right, we know an argument gonna have, might not have any premises, guaranteed to have a conclusion. Suppose I tell you an argument's sound. What's the truth value of its conclusion?
It has to be true.
Tell me why.
Because it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, and the premises are true.
Bingo, right? We just take our two definitions together. It's valid, which means it's impossible for premises to be true and conclusion false. And because of the definition of soundness, we know its premises are true. Ergo, true conclusion. Cool, look at this. We're not even 10 slides in and we're already doing metalogic. It's amazing. Good job. So in light of these definitions, we might ask ourselves a bunch of other things. Could we have an argument that's valid but not sound? Can anybody give me an example? Yeah, the Mars's Moons one, right? That's a valid argument, but by definition can't be sound because at least one of the premises is false. Right? How about an argument that's sound but not valid? No, it's baked into the definition, right? How about an argument that's neither valid nor sound? Can anybody think of one? We sort of saw one that's pretty close. Yeah, if we tweak that one a little bit, right, we can easily turn that one into an invalid, unsound argument, right? Just have Nathan's not human or something like this. Right? Again, nice. How about last one? Argument that's both valid and sound? Better hope to God we have it. Otherwise, this is a real empty definition. Right? Cool. So we'll talk more about these notions. We'll talk a little bit about their interrelationship in the tutorials, but it's helpful just to kind of get a play. So all of this was just a bit to warm up, to basically tell you logic is the science of valid reasoning. It's concerned, at least as I understand it, with settling whether arguments are valid or invalid. We're interested in that notion. It's our big key notion. Now, we're also interested in some other concepts too, but the big thing, the goal, is to track validity. And why validity? Well, here's one reason. Settling whether an argument's valid guarantees that the conclusion is going to follow from the premises. That is, at minimum, the argument is one we need to at least pay attention to the truth value of the premises. It passes the minimum bar of being an acceptable argument. Now we get to decide whether the premises are true or false. Got to go do some real work. This highlights one of the major motivations for studying formal logic. Formal logic gives you a way to tell whether arguments are good or bad, regardless of the truth or falsity of the premises. You don't have to be an expert in something to understand whether arguments made in that area are good or bad. I don't have to be a marine biologist to understand that certain arguments in a paper I'm reading are just terrible, because the arguments just don't follow. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. It's invalid. Even if you're spitting true facts at me, those true facts don't get you to your conclusion as much as you might want it to. So this is a great thing to study if you're lazy like me and you don't actually want to go do any empirical work. I just get to stand at the chalkboard and do my work all day. It's amazing. So how are we going to do it? So formal logic works mostly by employing formal languages. And these formal languages strip away irrelevant material, laying bare the syntax or structure of arguments. Formal languages are languages with precise syntax and semantics. They're designed for use in particular situations, especially when natural language is unsuitable. Does everyone know what I mean when I say natural language? This might be a notion that I haven't talked about, right? So English is a natural language. Dutch, French, pretty much any language that you actually speak is going to be a natural language. Formal languages are going to be things like the stuff we learn. Coding languages are often formal languages. They have very specific syntax and semantical structures. The idea is to eliminate ambiguity. Contrast is English versus Python. English is a natural one. Python is, in some sense, a very good formal language. So what are we going to do in this course? We're going to learn 2 formal languages. Come on down. The first formal language is truth functional logic. This is going to be a stepping stone to get us to first order logic, because first order logic is where the money is. So in effect, what we're going to do is learn TFL. That's where we're going to learn to walk. And then FOL is when we start to maybe lightly jog. That's the plan. These languages are tools, and they're tools designed specifically to help us assess validity and associated notions. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. TFL in particular is an amazing sledgehammer. When all else fails, just use TFL and keep hitting at it. So that's the plan. That's what we're going to do. Why should you care? Well, I mean, there's the obvious, which is that this is a mandatory course. So, but I think there's actual genuine motivations here. So I think there's philosophical uses of logic. This is by far the best tool for assessing the goodness or badness of arguments. There's intrinsic motivations. I think this stuff's just fun. Maybe more interesting for some of you, there's a whole load of functionality that follows from this. Actually, I was meeting with one of the mentors, I think, for some of you guys earlier, and they were doing some programming, and they said, like, oh my God, this actually really helped. And I put a bunch of things in computer science that basically stemmed from research in logic. I'm not going to go through the whole list. So formal logic has some upshots. I think it's fascinating. It's extremely useful. And yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. So I hope that the sales pitch there was interesting. I hope that you're convinced. Again, it kind of doesn't matter because you have to be here anyway. But at least I'm trying to get you slightly excited about it. Okay. So what we'll do, we'll go through some of the background notions. We'll get to about half an hour or so and then take our break. So just under 15 minutes or so before break. Is that okay with everybody? Beautiful. Okay. Ooh, I should ask, are there any questions so far? Please feel free, if you do, put your hand up. Do not feel stressed or bad about asking questions. That's the whole fucking reason I'm here. Yes.
I'm not sure I really clearly understood what is validity.
Good. So here's the idea. Please, asking these questions, because if there's one person, there's fucking 50 who have the same question and just don't have the guts to ask. So the basic idea about validity is to try and give us a way to understand this notion of follows from. So the underlying thought, the intuitive thought, was a good argument is one where the conclusion follows from the premises. Or another way to put it is, whenever the premises are true, it guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So that basically if the motivations are true, so is the upshot. That's this notion of follow through, or follow from. Validity is our attempt to try and precisify that a little. So that's the idea that validity is trying to capture. It's a way to make sense of this notion of follows from. And the way we formulated it is, well, what we've done is I've kind of thrown in some negations. Right? Instead of saying whenever the premises are true, so is the conclusion, I've said something that's equivalent. I've said it's impossible to make the premises all true and the conclusion false. This is the same as saying whenever the premises are true, so is the conclusion. Do we see the connection there? Good question. Any other ones? Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about a zero premise argument.
Yeah.
And, well, does a zero premise argument have all of its premises, but have a true truth value or not.
Good. So to get to the zero premise argument, I want to lay out some more notions, and we'll come back to your question. It's a good question. Basically, zero premise arguments, the valid ones, have something really funny about them, other than the fact they don't have any premises. There's something else that's cheap and cheery. Yeah.
So like if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false, regardless the truth of the premises, the argument is still valid.
Ah, shit, you already got me, man. That's what I was going for. Yes, that's the other edge case, right? So we have two ways to guarantee validity. If we have jointly inconsistent premises, like with this case, or if we have a conclusion that cannot be false. I'm about to introduce some notions, some terminology to talk about this, but I'll just go ahead and give it to you. If we have a conclusion that's necessarily true, don't care about the premises. Ain't no way to make the conclusion false, so there ain't no way to make the premises true and the conclusion false. Can't do it. Just like with this case, the other way around. Sorry, I'll repeat that because I think I went a little quick. Right? So again, remember, why in this case is the argument valid? It's valid because it's impossible to make all the premises true. So the rest is just gravy. Cool. Now what happens if we have a conclusion that's always true? It's the same thing. I can't make the conclusion false, so the other bit's just gravy. I don't care about it. I can't do this bit, so I can't do this bit and that other stuff too. Yeah.
Because it's swallowed from, so it
Okay. So we'll talk more about it in just a second. But yeah, good. Okay. So there were some other hands, and yeah.
What we have realized that has nothing to do with the conclusion at the end.
So we're hitting already something funny about validity, right? The way we've characterized it, it's just about the truth or falsity of the premises. It doesn't say anything about the content. It doesn't say anything at all about their meaning. It's just about whenever these are true, so is this one. Doesn't care what they say. So this already maybe tracks one thing that we're going to talk about just shortly, but it's worth flagging up. The tools that we're going to develop, at least initially, do not care about meaning. We are only interested in truth functionality. That's why it's called TFL. So this is a valid argument because, again, all we're concerned with is the truth guarantees the truth. Were these all true? So must this one. Yeah.
How do we know it's true if we don't care about the content?
Good. So, give me a minute and I'll talk about it. Promise. Not just blowing smoke here. What we're going to do, just to spoil the last part, is we're going to replace sentences with letters. And we're going to stipulate truth values. In fact, we're going to stipulate all the possible combinations of truth values. It'll give us a matrix, and the matrix then tells us about validity or non-validity. We do not care what it means, we just need to symbolize. Beautiful. Again, I think the secret to this is basically a maths class, guys. It's just maths, but with some funny symbols. Okay. Cool. So let me quickly talk about a few of these background things, basically just to put some stuff aside, and then we'll take our break. Okay? So here's the first thing I want to flag up, and I'm going to flag it up basically to say, here's some stuff we're not going to do. All right? I think you probably already talked about this with Michael and Yamina this morning, but if not, that's okay. So when we think about arguments, there's actually at least 3 different types. So far, we've talked about arguments like this. We'll call them deductive arguments, where the idea is that the premises are supposed to guarantee the conclusion. Right? This is that follows from idea. But there's also arguments like this. Right? Okay, I dropped the clicker yesterday and it fell to the ground. I also dropped it the day before and it fell to the ground. And the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that. So I'm very fun. I drop the clicker every day for 98 days straight. And then I say, cool, if I drop it right now, it's going to fall to the ground. So note, this structure is projecting forward based on past facts. We're taking previous occurrences and saying the next one's going to be like this. Fun question. Is this argument valid?
No.
No, right? There's a possible situation where all the premises are true and the conclusion's false. In fact, we've really quickly and very easily just run into Hume's problem of induction. Induction's cool, but there's no guaranteed connection that past will be like future pasts. That is, future occurrences will be like what came before. Yeah.
What would be like the false one for the inductive one? So it's not relevant. No,
So I mean, one case might be instead of it falling, it just quantum tunnels somewhere else, or just fucking explodes when I let go, right? You can think of a bunch of different cases.
but they don't have to be true.
All that matters is that there's a possibility, right? So one of the things we'll talk a little bit about is what the notion of possibility is here. But note, the first one is even physically possible, which is kind of fun. Unlikely, real unlikely, but could happen. Here's another kind of argument. Have you guys heard of abductive arguments before? Sometimes called inference to the best explanation? No? So, Sherlock Holmes talks about, he does deduction, he's full of shit. He does abduction. This is basically the kind of argument he uses. So here's an example. It's easiest to kind of come at it this way. We have, right, Bill and Ted had a falling out last week. They're no longer speaking to each other. This morning, I saw them jamming in their garage. Conclusion, Bill and Ted must have made up at some point. They must be friends again. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is meant to be an explanation for how these apparently disjunct situations can fit together. Now note, is this argument valid? No, I mean, they might be hate jamming, I guess. So abductive arguments basically work by postulating explanations that kind of post hoc explain the situation. Both of these occur all the time. In science, especially. Science is based off these 2 kinds of arguments. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, we are not really going to talk about them at all. We're just going to deal with deductive arguments. Now, why? Look, valid deductive arguments necessarily express unbreakable connections between the premises and the conclusion. That's just what validity is. Good abductive and inductive arguments do not necessarily express that kind of unbreakable connection. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. They can still be good, but goodness for those is a different kind of thing than goodness for deductive arguments. Good deductive arguments, there's a beauty and a strength that these other ones do not have. So for example, here's a really good inductive argument. Good evidence, everything like that. Really bad conclusion. Trigger warning if you're vegan, I guess. So we have 2 turkeys. Right? Hey, look, farmers fed us a whole slew for the last long while. Looks like it's going to be all okay today. Unfortunately, the turkeys are ignorant of American cultural traditions. Happy Thanksgiving. Good inductive argument, if there's been enough days beforehand. This is the problem with not tracking validity. You lose your head. So let me just stress, right? Jokes aside, this isn't to say inductive or abductive arguments are bad or that they're worse than deductive ones. Not at all, right? It just is to say that there's a level of epistemic security that deductive arguments have that the other ones will never touch. And that's fine. What we're after is just trying to track that, trying to make sense of that and figure out when it holds and when it doesn't. So in this class, we're just going to focus on deductive arguments. In critical and scientific thinking, which I believe you guys had this morning, you'll talk more about these other ones. In fact, I think Michael said you guys that people didn't do so well with the conjunctive fallacy. About the is like a librarian and votes. Yeah, cool. So that's the kind of stuff you'll do in the other class. In this class, we just do deduction. Okay. Last slide before break, and so just give me 5 minutes. So that's one thing we're going to do. We're going to set aside inductive and abductive, just focus on deductive arguments. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to set aside a huge swath of sentences. Right? So when we think about sentences in natural language, they can break down into at least two types: acitoric sentences and non-acitoric sentences. So an acitoric sentence makes an assertion. It says something about the world. In particular, it says something that's truth evaluable. Contrast that with non-acitoric ones, which don't. So for example, questions, right? Is the cup black? Let's think about just that question. Is the question true or false? That's kind of a mistake. The question doesn't have a truth value. The answer might, but the question itself doesn't. Similarly, right, imperatives, commands, they might be obeyed or not obeyed, but it seems wrong to say that the imperative itself is true or false. It just doesn't really look like it plays that kind of game. Right? Same thing with exclamations. All of these don't seem to say the kinds of things that can be true or false. We're only after assertions. That's all we're going to focus on. In some sense, this is really just to simplify things for ourselves. We can eventually develop logics that accommodate these notions, these parts of speech. But for now, we're just going to focus on acitoric sentences. That's all we're going to deal with in this course. Last thing, this is actually pretty substantive. One of the big things we're going to be focused on is truth values. We're going to work with the assumption that there's only two. There's true and there's false. Ain't nothing else. These are the two that we have, the two that we're going to use for our logics. Other logics can have more. We'll talk about those in the very last lecture. But again, we've got to start walking before we can run. So we're going to work with just the two. We're also going to make two other massive assumptions. The assumptions are there's no gaps and no gluts. So what do I mean by that? No gaps means that every sentence has a truth value. Everything is either true or false. So for every sentence P, either P is true or P is false. Again, we're only thinking about acitoric ones. And here's the other one, no gluts. This is to say there's no truth value gluts. There's no sentence that's both true and false. Together, these two assumptions say everything falls on one side or the other and nothing falls in both. Before we go to break, do the assumptions make sense? So let's again stress, they're assumptions. There are things we're going to take on to make our machinery work. We can get rid of them, and we can tell another story. It's just a little bit more complex. But basically, this assumption, together with this, and the machinery I'm going to give you, is full-blown classical logic. Cool. Okay. So why don't we take a break? We'll take a break until 45. So 10 minutes or so. Is that? Oh. Sorry, this is way off. To 50 on this clock. To 50 on this clock, because it's way off.